Jungle.
In this video, you're going to be learning about the seismic retrofit of homes with cripple walls. There are two types of homes, ones without cripple walls and those with cripple walls. Homes with cripple walls have a few steps that go into the front door, usually 3 or more. Homes without cripple walls will have usually 1 to 2 and sometimes 3. So that three number is, that's kind of, it could be either way. It could be a no cripple wall or it could be with a cripple wall. But anyway, this video is on a cripple wall retrofits. If you'd like to know more about no cripple wall retrofits, if, for example, your house only has 2 steps to get into the front door, please click on the card above and it'll take you to the video that talks about those. Retrofitting is not an art. It is not a hunch. It is not something you just look at and you make things up, which we see all the time. It is an actual science, and I'm going to show you what the science is behind your retrofit. Another thing we're going to look at is what can happen to your house if it is not retrofitted. We're going to look at things that contractors often skimp on, not because they mean to, but sometimes there's parts of the building code that they just don't follow as carefully as they should. We're going to look at ways that even brand new houses can use retrofits. And finally, you will get a great education. So whoever you happen to hire, you will have the background in order to interview them, get a good sense of if they know what they're doing or not, and then you can get the best retrofit you possibly can for the best price. It is effective. The things that you're being recommended for your retrofit, they've been well studied, they've been proven to be effective, and probably the most striking example of this whole thing was in Santa Cruz in the 1989 earthquake. There was an architect and he had 2 identical houses, same year construction, same shape, same everything, and each one had a cripple wall, and he retrofitted one, and before he could retrofit the other one, the earthquake hit. And what happened was, the one that had been retrofitted got about $5,000 in plaster damage, and the other one fell off its foundation and got $200 and something thousand worth of damage. It was really serious. Practically had to, tear the house down. So it is really effective. And so let's go ahead and see how it's done. And I think it'll make sense to you why it's so effective. I have met other contractors and some engineers who recommend doing work above the foundation. In other words, they want to go into the house and tear off sheetrock or tear out siding on the outside and put in a bunch of plywood and bolts and all that stuff. And this purpose of this particular presentation is to show you that that is absolutely unnecessary. So the first thing I'd like to show you is that here's a house that you can see that it fell. This was from the Alaska earthquake, and it fell, I don't know, 4 feet or so, and you can see how the windows aren't even broken. The house is otherwise intact. The roof is there, the walls are there, everything's there, even though, like I said, the windows aren't even broken. So if you can keep them together or on the foundation, they do great. And so that's a really critical thing, is the foundation connection. Here's another house. This was from the Santa Cruz earthquake, exact same thing. You can see how the house had a considerable amount of damage when it fell. This was a soft story condition, living area above a garage. But, overall, I mean, just look at it. It's got a, there's nothing, nothing catastrophic above the foundation. So again, the critical thing is to make sure that it is properly attached to the foundation. Now, when I was working at FEMA, this is one of the houses that I looked at. I was actually the first person inside this house, and as you can see, there's the top of the stairs, and the house is down about 5 feet from the top of the stairs. You can see where the the windows are. The lower story windows, they would have been up 5 feet. It's a got a lot of damage inside, but look, the windows are still there. Again, this This is because the floor is, it's solid wood, then you have a roof, and you have all the four sides, and you have lots of walls inside from bathrooms, kitchens, etc. And all these are all geometrically cubes. And a cube is a very strong geometric shape, which is why you don't see a lot of damage from the first floor up. So that's why we don't recommend anything be done there. Now here's a house that had plaster, and this plaster fell off the walls. The plumbing was torn out. The electrical was torn out. It was a big mess. They couldn't live there. Maybe tore it down. That's what happens when they fall from the foundation. But if they don't fall from the foundation, they do really well. So here's a really good example of a cripple wall collapse. So you can see the stairs came up here into the front door. Well, come here and look at the floor. The floor, is way down here. So, it's fallen about 3 feet. So the floor now is at this location. It used to be at this location. So this house actually, this happened in Watsonville. I was an inspector for the Federal Emergency Management Agency in 1989, and Watsonville was my territory. And I went by this house. I actually went inside and I saw all the damage. I remember it was really bad. The plumbing was screwed up. The electrical was torn out. The plaster absolutely everywhere. And it was a big mess. I thought they were going to fix it, but they didn't. I drove by like a week later and it was a vacant lot. So this kind of damage can have very serious consequences to your house and to your life. So anyway, it's certainly worth looking at a cripple wall retrofit to keep this kind of thing from happening. So right now we're going to go into the nuts and bolts of cripple wall retrofits, and I think when we're all done you'll have a really good idea of what your house needs and why we plan to do what we plan to do. Cripple walls are braced with plywood to keep them from collapsing. Right here, this is the cripple wall. This is the floor you walk on. Right here is the foundation. A mirror image of that is right here, the floor you walk on, the cripple wall itself, and then the foundation. So earthquake forces come and try to topple the wall over, and so we need to prevent that. And this is done with a piece of plywood that's a special type of piece of plywood constructed in a special way. So you've heard about bolting a house, and let's go ahead and see what they actually do and why you need them. So this right here, this hatch mark right here, that represents a cripple wall that has the plywood on it, and right here is the foundation. Now what can happen is, even though our cripple wall is braced and it's not going to collapse, if you can see here, it's going to slide off the foundation. So what happens here, the earth is moving, basically pushing the foundation this way, and then through inertia the house is going to want to slide off. So it keeps going as it keeps shaking, back and forth like that. It really starts to move on the foundation, and then eventually it'll tip right off. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that this cripple wall is well attached to the foundation. So we just don't want this thing moving in any way at all from the foundation. So we need to attach it right here. So we use bolts. And we come down this way and we attach the cripple wall to the foundation with bolts that go down like that. So it looks just like this. Remember the cripple wall we just looked at? So here's the cripple wall right here. Here's the floor you walk around on, and the base of the cripple wall right here, that's called the mudsill. That's that pink part. So what we do is we just take bolts and we drive them through the mudsill right here. We drill holes and put them in there real sturdy. So now the base of the cripple wall cannot slide, and if it can't slide, then you're going to avoid this thing from happening. So that's why that's what bolts do. They just bolt the base of the cripple wall to the foundation so that the cripple wall itself doesn't collapse. That's what the plywood protects it from. And then also the base of the cripple wall doesn't slide, and that's what the bolts do. So let's take a look and see how that movement is prevented with bolts. So up here is our cripple wall again. So there's the cripple wall that we saw is prevented from collapse with the plywood. There's the floor you walk around on, and here's the mudsill that we just looked at. And again, we need to try to keep that mudsill from sliding off the foundation. So let's look at the blow up below. So here's the mudsill that we were looking at right here. Here's the the bottom of the cripple wall, and right here is the foundation. Now what's going to happen is the earthquake force, as shown by this red arrow, is going to push on the mudsill. And as you can see, it's starting to slide on the top of the foundation. And that's what we need to prevent from happening. If the bottom of the cripple wall slides, then the whole thing goes with it. So we need to put in some bolts to make sure that doesn't happen. So this is what we do. We take these bolts and they go through the mudsill. Then the bolts will go in, I don't know, it's 8, 10. You can just go in as deep as they have to go according to the manufacturer. And then it's all done. Now notice that this is a square washer right here. And we put those on for reasons that you will discover shortly. We also put in something called a Mudsill plate. We're the only company that uses those if you look around, and they're also very important. So anyway, that's basically how bolts work. After the 1994 earthquake in Los Angeles, I flew down there to see what the structural engineers and the building officials had learned. And two of the things that they taught me was about these two special washers that really make bolt performance improve drastically. So this first one here, this is called the Mudsill plate. It should have become part of the building code, but it didn't. And then this one here is the plate washer, and we're going to go over both of those right now. So probably the most exciting thing I learned about were these special washers right here called Mudsill plates. There was a lot of splitting of the mudsills in the Northridge earthquake, and this was developed as a response to that. And it's a very good product, and we still use them. So what it is these little tangs right here, they are embedded into the wood. And there's this one, and on the opposite side you would see one right here, and you'd see one right here, and then the bolt goes right through the center. So what happens as the mudsill moves this way, that force goes into these little tangs, because the mudsill, it tries to split. And when it tries to split, this tang and this tang, the other tangs too, prevent that. That probably wasn't really clear. Hopefully it'll be a little bit clearer later. But another thing that these bolts was very remarkable about them was they also increased bolt performance. So what you see right here, that's based on some tests they did. And they found if a bolt was, round washer, it could resist so many pounds of linear feet, so many pounds of force per bolt, and that's 840 pounds per bolt. And this is an MSP, that's a Mudsill plate, and it went up 59%. If you put it on the bottom of the bolt, it would resist this much, 98% more. And here, top and bottom, it was really remarkable. A huge increase. So these special washers are something we put on every single retrofit that we install. Every bolt that you get will have one of these on them. And these are, I believe, unless there's some other company that did so, that we're the only ones in the country that still uses these. These were made by Harlan Metal Products, and unfortunately they did go out of business, I don't know, 10, 15, well, I think it's 15 years at least at this point. And we bought tens of thousands of them. They were going out of business, the only ones that made them, so we are the only ones that will have these in our retrofit installations. So this is the kind of damage that a mudsill can sustain if you only have a round washer and not a mudsill plate. So as you can see here, here's the round washer. And the mudsill, what happened was it, pushed this way because of the earthquake. The earthquake is trying to slide it, off the foundation right here. And that ramming force caused it to split. Now, if this had had a mudsill plate on it, it wouldn't have split like this. The damage really was the splitting. And so as we just saw, those little tangs that, would embed in the wood, there would have been one here, and then one here, and then one here, and one here. And then as this mudsill tried to split, it would have been resisted by the tangs that are on each side that we just looked at. So that's why these mudsill plates are so important. That's why we put them on every single bolt. They'll prevent the bolt from splitting, the mudsill from splitting, and they'll also increase bolt strength considerably. As I mentioned earlier, the other thing they, taught me about was this plate washer. They'd actually done tests back in 1992, and they discovered how important they were at that particular time and how much they increased bolt strength. So these are square, so that's obvious to tell the plate washer because it's square like that. And this is the big deal, is the actual, the strength, the amount of force that they can resist is shown by that curve right there, and what it is without a plate washer. So it had a big increase in strength. So what used to increase this much strength at a certain amount of force, and then all of a sudden it's gone way, way up. So we put these and Mudsill plates on every bolt we install. The plate washers increase strength, and the Mudsill plates prevent splitting and increase strength. So that's about as good as it gets when putting in a bolt. So Mudsill plates and plate washers were both developed after the Northridge earthquake in Los Angeles. And this is an interesting story because I went down there in 1994, learned about this, and I imported them from Los Angeles to put them on every retrofit we did, and they didn't actually become part of the California Building Code and in use in the Bay Area until July of 1999. So that was about 5 years later before anyone else started using them. And the thing that really struck me about this is, why didn't the building departments in Berkeley call the ones down in Los Angeles and say, hey, what did you guys discover? And they said, oh, we put in some plate washers, really made a big difference. And they didn't do that. And I completely astounded. I'm still surprised by the whole thing. And it's the same with many, many things in retrofitting. You really got to keep up on it, find out what happened in previous earthquakes, what research has been done, because you can't rely on the building code to show you the best way to do something. And these plate washers are a case in point. There's a certain type of damage that happens to wood which plate washers help resist. It's called cross-grain bending, and we're going to go over that right now. So this piece of wood, you can see it's split down the middle, but it didn't split because there was an earthquake that moved on the Mudsill and rammed against the bolt, which is what we saw previously. Which is what Mudsill plates were for. But in this case, the board is actually being bent up. So what has happened here, theoretically, if there's something like plywood that's pulling up on the edge of the Mudsill, this can split right down the middle, and that, obviously that causes a lot of problems. So let's go ahead and see what, cross-grain bending actually looks like. A number of years ago, when I was doing research on plate washers and cross-grain bending, I contacted the research scientists at the laboratory with the American Plywood Association, and that's the biggest testing lab in the country. Actually, I think it's the biggest one in the world, where they test shear walls and plywood performance, and cross-grain bending is one of the things that they deal with all the time. So this research lab sent to me this photograph as an illustration of what happens in cross-grain bending in the tests they've done. So as you can see, earthquake force in at least in a lab, the simulation is pulling up on the plywood. So the whole thing, this plywood is pulling up all along here. And what has happened here is that the Mudsill, this is a test Mudsill, has split right here as the force pulls up on the edge of the Mudsill. So that's what cross-grain bending is, and that's what we're trying to prevent. And that's, a big, big benefit of using plate washers on every bolt that we install. There's something else we need to do in a cripple wall retrofit, and that is install something called shear transfer ties. And we're going to learn about those right now. So if you recall, we had our, our house is, it's got the plywood on it, shown by that, that cross hatching. We have it on this side, we have it on this side. And then the earthquake is starting to shake. And then in this case, what's happened is this plywood is all, the cripple wall is braced. It's bolted to the, the Mudsill like we saw before. But now the house is starting to shake on top of the cripple wall. So what happens is it's shaking like this. Then it'll shake a little bit more, and it can slide off of the cripple wall because we haven't attached the house to the cripple wall itself. So what that means is you can, you put plywood all over it, you bolt the heck out of it, but then you don't attach the house to that, and you're open to a lot of damage. We see this all the time. We'll see houses where they put in the bolts, they put in the plywood, but they just don't understand that they need to connect the floor to it, and it is obviously very critical. So let's go ahead and look at what happens again and where we do this. Remember, this is our cripple wall. And then this is our foundation, our mudsill, which we've already bolted. So we've already bolted this piece, the mudsill. We put plywood over here, but now we have to worry about this connection. Remember, this is the floor you walk on. This piece of wood right here is called a floor joist, and what we're worried about is we're worried about that floor joist just sliding right on off the top. So we put in a piece of steel called a shear transfer tie to keep the floor joist from sliding on top of the cripple wall. So this is how shear transfer ties work. It's pretty simple. So this is the floor that you walk around on. Again, this is the cripple wall right here. And this is called a floor joist. And this is the top of the cripple wall. And what happens is the earthquake force is going to come here, and it's going to hit that floor joist right there and try to slide it off the top of the cripple wall. So it's real simple what we do. We just take a piece of steel called the shear transfer tie. There's one here, and there's one here, and there's one here. And that way, when the earthquake force comes here, the shear transfer tie is nailed to this piece of wood, that's the floor joist, and it's also nailed to the top of the cripple wall right along here, and then the movement is prevented by that. So this always occurs in this part of the cripple wall. So when you look at a job that a contractor has done, you go underneath the house and you'll see the plywood and you'll see the bolts. But if you don't see some steel up in this area right here shown by purple, that means the contractor missed a very important component. The shear transfer tie connection is probably the most difficult connection of all, and it's not always just this simple steel like we just looked at and we're going to look at right now. There's lots of variables, and these houses are all built different. The framing is different. Back then they didn't have codes. There were some things that was fairly common, then they wouldn't be. You wouldn't see them. So we're going to look at a traditional one like now. We saw some drawings, and now we're going to look at some real shear transfer tie and see what they look like. Right up here is the floor that you walk around on. This is a floor joist, and this is a floor joist right here. As the floor joists try to move, they get transferred, that force gets transferred through the shear transfer tie into the upper top plate of the cripple wall. That upper top plate is attached to the bolts, which are way down here that you can't see through the plywood, and then in the end the earthquake force gets transferred into the bolts and down into the ground and is dissipated, and thereby we have saved the house. So right now I would like to review the three components of a cripple wall retrofit. The first thing I'd like to look at is the cripple wall itself. So here's the cripple wall. We don't want it to collapse. So this is the force that's going to cause it to collapse. This red arrow is the earthquake force. And as you can see, the 2x4s are, they're starting to topple over. And this is the floor you walk around on. So basically the whole floor is going at that point. And so what we do is we put a piece of plywood on the cripple wall to prevent that from happening. Now plywood is extremely effective. It's been tested many, many times in research laboratories. But just realize nailing up a piece of plywood is a lot more complicated than you think. There's actually a 180-page book that was published by the International Code Council called Shear Walls. And it was, a big part of it was how to install the plywood properly. So it's, looks simple. You think about it as being really simple, but it's not. There's actually a whole lot to it. So the other component is, we don't want this, the cripple wall with the plywood to go sliding off the foundation. So what we do is we put in these bolts. So just to review it real quickly, here's the mudsill, which is the same thing as that. And earthquake force is going to try to push it off the foundation. And then these bolts, which go through the mudsill into the concrete, and these are square, which means that there's plate washers there, and underneath those plate washers you'll find mudsill plates, which we looked at previously. Now the next thing that we have to worry about is the board that supports the floor you walk around on. Keep it from sliding on top of the cripple wall. So this is a sort of force we're worried about, the movement we're worried about. Earthquake force comes this way, pushes the floor joist and the floor that you walk around on. It can push it right off the top of the cripple wall, and we definitely want to prevent that. And so this is real simple. We just put in shear transfer ties. Remember, it's nailed to this piece of wood. the floor joist, and then it's also nailed to the top of the cripple wall right here. And so when the floor joist tries to move, that movement is prevented by the shear transfer ties. So that's pretty much it. It's pretty simple. And any retrofit should have all three of these things. Sometimes we'll look at a house and it's only got the bolts in it, and they didn't strengthen the cripple wall. So what's the point? The mud sill is going to stay where it is, and the rest of the cripple wall is going to collapse and take the house with it. And then sometimes we'll just see the plywood and they don't put the bolts in. We see all sorts of things. So anyway, when you're evaluating bids and when you're talking to contractors and looking at the existing retrofit you might have had done, make sure and check for these three things. So let's take a look at this viewed from underneath a house so we can see what these things actually look like. So earthquake force right here is pushing on the floor joist, so it's trying to push it this way. And when that happens, it ends up pushing on the shear transfer tie, which is right here. So now this and this are connected, so this cannot move on top of that. Now we have a piece of plywood, and you can't see the plywood because you couldn't see anything else. So we'd have a piece of plywood that would be right here connecting the mud sill up here all the way over, and it would be nailed up here. So that would be nailed here, and it would be nailed here. So then when this top plate tries to move, it can't move because it's attached to this piece of wood, the mud sill, because they're connected. And then this piece of wood, the mud sill, and then is bolted into the foundation. So then that movement, it gets driven into the bolts, and then those bolts go into the concrete, and then ultimately it dissipates down into the ground. So that's how the whole assembly works. We have everything. We've got the shear transfer tie, we've got the plywood, we've got the bolts, and that's pretty much it. That's what's called a load path. So it's a load, which is the horizontal force of the earthquake, and then the path to get down to the ground. So there's another very important connection that is almost always, if not always, overlooked in all the retrofits that we look at, and is extremely important, and I'm going to go over that with you right now. Now, a lot of times we don't have a choice about where we're going to put our shear walls. So we come across here on a cripple wall, and we'll find all kinds of pipes, we'll find gas meters, we'll find sections where the wall was just taken apart, for whatever reason. So we don't have a lot of choice. Sometimes we can put them on the end, sometimes in the middle. We just put them wherever we can possibly get them, and we never know for sure where that's going to be. And there's a problem with that. So the top of a cripple wall can easily be 50 feet long, from end to end. So that would be from here to here will be 50 feet. And they don't make boards that are 50 feet long. So what you will find is you'll find a board that's 10 feet long, and then another one that's 12 feet long, and then another one that's, say, 25 feet long. And so all of these, create breaks where they're butted up to each other. So here's an example right here. This is a break in the top plate. So that's the break. So there's a board this way. This is one length of board, and then there's the other board that goes this way. And we'll see right now why that is a problem. So what happens is, let's say we put our shear wall right here at the end of the cripple wall. So here it is, it's nailed to this top plate right here. And then here's the top plate, and there's a break in it, and then the rest of the house is all sitting on top of this top plate right here. So when the floor goes like this of the house is sitting on top of this top plate, so it's going to also move this top plate this way. Remember, the house moves. The house is attached to the top plate of the cripple wall, so the top plate moves this way. And when the top plate moves this way, there's a break right here. So the force, that movement, it stops right here. It's not connected over here. So because it's not connected, all the force that's right here, it doesn't have anywhere to go. It just stops right here at the break, and it does not transfer over to our shear wall. So what we do is we've developed a technique by which we can make sure that the earthquake forces do transfer back to the shear wall wherever it might be, and I'm going to show you what that is right now. So all we need to do is we need to put nails on either side of the break in the upper top plate so that we can connect the two together. Now the upper top plate is different from the lower top plate because the upper top plate right here and here's the lower top plate, all the entire house sits right on top of this upper top plate. It doesn't sit on the bottom one, it sits on the top one. So that's why it's so critical. So we want to make sure that when the house is moving on top of this upper top plate, that force transfers back over to the other side. And remember, our shear wall is down this way. So all we need to do is we need to put nails on this side, and then we nails on this side. I mean, we can calculate it and figure out exactly how many nails to put in, but man, just nail the heck out of it. You got a nail gun, you just shoot a billion nails on either side and you're all done. So let's see what those nails do to make sure that the entire house is connected to our shear wall. So this right here is the floor that you walk around on, and then this is a floor joist that supports the floor. And you see how this floor joist, there's a nail that comes in here and a nail that comes in here. There's a nail that comes in here, and then there's a nail that comes in here. So when the floor tries to move, it goes into that floor joist and into the nails, see the nails right here, which in turn go to the upper top plate. So the upper top plate is going to move that way as the floor goes this way. When it goes that way, it pulls on these nails right here in the upper top plate. When those nails pull this way, they in turn pull down the lower top plate, because you see how the nails come up from the lower top plate into the upper top plate, lower top plate up there. So they're connected. So the nails pull this way, and when they pull this way, they pull on the lower top plate, and then they pull into these nails again on the lower top plate, which are connected to the nails, connected to the upper top plate right here. So now it pulls on the upper top plate, which then in turn pull against the nails on top of our shear wall, and then all the force goes into our shear wall, which is right where it belongs. So let's go ahead and look at the big picture on that. So here we have the break in the top plate. This entire, cripple wall and floor and everything is disconnected from our shear wall. So now what we've done is we put a whole bunch of nails on this side of the break, a whole bunch of nails on this side of the break. So when the earthquake force comes this way, it travels, through the nails into the lower top plate, because remember, the nails go into the upper and into the lower. So it goes into the nails in the upper top plate. Those in turn are connected to the lower top plate. So then the lower top plate goes this way, comes over to the nails right here. Those nails are connected to the upper top plate right here. So what finally happens is all the force gets pulled on that upper top plate, and this is where all the nails are in the upper top plate. And so all the force is transferred into the shear wall where it belongs. So you see why this connection is so critical. Now, if you don't do this, a large part of your house may not be protected because it's not attached to a shear wall. Remember, a shear wall is designed to attach the floor of the house from the foundation. And if you don't make these connections, joined together like we just looked at, a certain part of the house, might be a big part of the house, will be disconnected from the foundation, and your retrofit will not work as you want it to. In fact, no matter where the break is, if you have 5 of them, 1 of them, how many of them you have, you need to connect all of them together so that all the force goes into the shear walls, which is what you want your retrofit to do. If you're comparing bids between contractors, they should talk about this. They need to be doing something, and they should be doing a lot. So really, really critical connection, because, if you don't do that, the rest of the house won't be connected to your shear walls, which are resisting all the earthquake, and you don't want that to happen. When I was on the International Code Council Committee writing guidelines for the San Francisco Bay Area, I wrote a paper on the Plywood to Mudsill connection. The reason I wrote that paper and researched it so thoroughly is because it's an absolutely critical connection. I would say the most critical connection in every retrofit. It's problematic, and I did come up with some innovative solutions that I would like to share with you. So in that paper, I actually looked at 4 different ways of making the plywood to mudsill connection. And right now I'm going to go over 2 of them. One we call the flush cut method, and one called the nailed blocking method. The flush cut method is the one we prefer to use, and I'll explain to you why. And then the nailed blocking method is the one that most contractors use, and it's also found in all the seismic retrofit guidelines. So I'm going to go over both of those right now. So this right here is the problem. So here you can see this is our cripple wall right here, and these are the 2x4s that form the wall. And then this right here is the mudsill. And as you can see, the mudsill is a lot wider, usually by 2 inches than the 2x4s. So these are normally 2x4s, so it's, 4 inches wide like that. And then this here will be 6 inches wide. And so what happens is if you go to put the plywood on, it'll end up sitting on top of the mudsill like that. So, obviously the plywood can't transfer forces into the bolts because it's just basically sitting right on top of them. So what we do to fix that is we actually will just cut a piece of the mudsill out like that, and we'll make it so that the mudsill is now flush with the 2x4s. So this 2x4 and this one, they're all now flush with the mudsill where we cut it out. And then what we do after that is we simply nail the piece of plywood up on the, into the mudsill and on the sides and over, at the top and everywhere, exactly like a mudsill is supposed to be done. So anyway, that is our preferred method. There aren't a whole lot of people that do it. I think we're the only ones I've ever seen that do it. It takes a special saw. It's pretty dangerous. You got to be really skilled to do this. But this is our preferred method. And I actually had it checked by a research laboratory, and you'll see what their conclusion. So one of the big advantages of using the flush cut method is in the end you can nail your plywood directly into old growth redwood. As you can see here, wood that's 1,200 years old, it's got a whole bunch of growth rings, it's going to be really, really high quality. It's going to, the nails are going to hold real well in the plywood, and there's actually, you can't get any better than that. So if you can see the one on the right hand side, that's from a tree farm, and you can see, that was just grew really quick. Growth rings are very far apart, and the quality of a retrofit and of a plywood connection is not going to be near as good as if you go into the old growth redwood. So right now we're going to go over the nailed blocking method, which is the other method I talked about earlier. And it's a method I would say 99% of the contractors use. Every single retrofit design I've seen by a structural engineer uses it, and it's in all the retrofit guidelines, and there's about 6 of them that are the government sponsored ones. And the reason they end up being done by the contractors, the engineers, etc., because that's the only thing that you find in print. So anyway, that's not the method that we use, but you do need to know about it. So first thing I'd like to do is just review everything we've learned up to now about Cripple wall retrofits. This has all the components that we normally need. So this here, remember, it has the plywood to keep the Cripple wall from collapsing. Here we have our shear transfer ties, also known as framing anchors, so that keep this floor joist from sliding on top. And then here's our bolts. And so the next thing we're going to look at here is this blocking right here. That's the nailed blocking method. So what's happened here is they took a block and then they nailed it into the mudsill. They did the same thing here. They put a bolt through it. Same thing here. And they did the same thing all along here. So here's another block and here's another block. So what they've done is they put those blocks on, and now they can nail straight into the block. So these nails go into the block. And as you can see, you see this little edge right here? That is the edge of the mudsill. So that edge of the mudsill is there showing that the plywood is still sitting on top of the mudsill, but it's been nailed into these blocks. So that's the nailed blocking method. Besides being forced to nail into tree farm wood, which is what the blocks are made out of, you also need to worry about the block splitting. What you see right here is fairly common. It happens, because the nails are pretty big. In order from an engineering point of view, you have to use pretty big nails, and they tend to split. What we've seen is, contractors, they just put in smaller nails, which don't have the capacity they need from an engineering point of view, but they do, make sure the blocks don't split. And the other thing is, there's been literally thousands of tests done on the method where the flush cut was, where you have the 2x4 mudsill, 2x4 on the sides, 2x4 at the top, where the whole thing is just all in one plane like that. There been no tests. American Plywood Association has not done any tests where they have used blocks. In fact, the letter you're going to see in a minute specifically states that they have not done any tests on that. And anyway, I look at that as a word of caution. So let's go ahead and see what the American Plywood Association had to say. So this is the letter I told you about that I got from the leading research laboratory in the world regarding the different ways to make the plywood to Mudsill connection. I did this when I was part of the International Code Council Committee, where I had access to people I wouldn't normally have access to. So he's a PhD guy in the reading research lab in the world. And so this is the letter that he sent me. What he said was that based on my professional opinion, I would judge the retrofit strategies in the following order from most preferred to least preferred. So number 1 was the flush cut Mudsill method, and number 4 was the nailed blocking method. So the most preferred is the one that we normally use. The least preferred is what you find in all the retrofit guidelines. I sent this letter to everyone on the committee, but the one person in the committee who had a lot of influence, he really didn't want to use it for political reasons. What those political reasons are, I'd rather not say. And if you would like a copy of this letter, you can email me. I'll send you the letter's got more information in it. And the engineer did not want me to include his name here. He just didn't want any more phone calls. So anyway, this is, I think, sums up everything that you can want to know about that connection to the Mudsill. Let's go ahead and see how Cripple wall retrofits can fail. The first failure can be the Mudsill. So here we see earthquake force pushing against the Mudsill, and then it's sliding right here unless you put the bolts in to prevent that from happening. The next way it fails is the Cripple wall can collapse. So here we have earthquake force coming this way. It's the 2x4 studs of the wall are starting to lean over, and we prevent that by putting in plywood. The next way it can fail is with the shear transfer ties. So here we have earthquake coming this way, and the floor is going to try to slide off the top of the Cripple wall right here. So we put in pieces of steel. The second mode of failure is called overturning, and the way that works is earthquake force comes this way and it pushes against the floor of the house, which in turn pushes at the top of the shear wall. You can see the shear wall is nailed up here at the top. And when it hits the shear wall, it tries to overturn like that. And when they overturn like that, the nails pull up from the Mudsill right here and become disconnected from the bolts. Now, if they disconnect from the bolts, then the ability to resist, the pushing force of the earthquake is greatly compromised. Now, I'd like to point out that the walls do, this is exaggerated. The walls do stay upright. I've never heard of a house that had shear walls that completely, collapsed. I imagine it could happen if the earthquake is big enough, but we need to resist this force to preserve the strength of the shear wall whenever we can. The other thing that can happen here is cross-grain bending that we looked at previously. So there's a type of hardware called the Holddown that's used to resist overturning, and we're going to be looking at those right now. So the types of hold downs we use are called PhD5s, and again the earthquake force hits this way, and then this shear wall tries to overturn just like that. And when it tries to overturn, it pushes up on this stud at the very end of the shear wall, and that stud is attached to this hold down right here, and that hold down is bolted to the end of the shear wall right here. And then that hold down is got this long steel rod that goes deep into the concrete, usually about 16 inches. And then that is glued to the concrete. So it's this amazingly strong glue. I guess, it's epoxy, and it's just unbelievably strong. We work with it all the time, and we are just so surprised that it's, it's just unbelievably strong. So what it does, it's so strong that it actually pulls up on the concrete. The bond between the bolt and the concrete doesn't fail. It pulls up on the concrete. And when it does that, it has to pull up on the entire foundation that's in this area. And it's just simply too heavy for the, when the hold down pulls up on it, that all thread pulls up on it, as you see by those, the red marks there, the foundation's simply too heavy and it won't overturn. Now you need them in both sides, because also earthquake forces, they come this way, but they'll also come this way. And when you come this way, the overturning force will be in the opposite direction that way. So that's why you see a hold down on this side as well. So right now we're going to look at an actual hold down and see how they work. So this is the hold down right here at PhD 5, and what's been happening here is this is bolted into this stud right here, which will be at the end of the shear wall. So it's bolted right here into the stud, and then down right here there's a bolt that goes way down deep into the concrete. That's where that miraculous epoxy is, right there. So what happens is, as the shear wall tries to overturn like that, the overturning force pulls up on the stud, which pulls up on the hold down, which pulls up on this this bolt right here, and because it's glued into the concrete, it tries to pull up on the concrete, and the concrete is extremely heavy, so it can't pull the shear wall up off of the mudsill. In the world of seismic retrofitting, we're always talking about pounds of force that are pushing against a house and the pounds of resistance to make sure a house does not fall off its foundation. So let me show you how that works. So right here we have a ground acceleration that goes underneath the house. The ground moves under the house, and you see how the house was originally upright. You can see that with those dotted lines. So it was originally upright, and now the house is trying to move underneath it. And inertia is causing the house to lean, and is also going to want to cause it to slide off the foundation right here. And that, of course, that's what a retrofit is to prevent. Now look, this is the exact same thing as if an earthquake force were pushing against the house. So you see how it is up right here, and then it gets pushed on, and then it's going to lean like that. So now this image and this image are identical, except one is caused by earthquake force moving underneath, one is caused by earthquake force pushing. Now that pushing force is rated in pounds of force. So all hardware is designed to resist a certain number of pounds of force. That has to do with plywood, bolts, any type of hardware at all. So what we do in every single retrofit is we figure out what the pounds of force will be, and then we figure out what type of hardware we'll need to install to resist that same number of pounds of force. So basically it works like this. This force right here, this ground acceleration, we translate that into a pounds of force that are pushing on the house, and then we take that number and then we come up with the hardware we need. So that's pretty much how it works, and throughout all the videos here, including this one, you will see references to pounds of force, and that's what it means. So one of the most important questions that needs to be answered is how much hardware or other retrofit components need to be installed. This is a matter of engineering. This is done through mathematical formulas, and we're going to go over that right now. There was an engineer on the committee I was on when we were writing Standard Plan A by the name of Jim Russell. And what he did is he spent about 6 weeks, even though he has very ill health, and he spent 6 weeks doing the calculations for every conceivable type of house in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so, for example, he would take a certain square footage of a house that had a certain, say, plaster inside, and it had a tile roof, and then it had siding that was made out of wood boards or something. And he would do all the engineering on that to find out what it would need in terms of retrofit components. And that's what we will be using on your house. So I'll just give you an example here. This is what the calculations look like. And here, for example, we had a geologist on the committee, and that geologist determined this is all the geological stuff, especially right up in here. And then Mr. Russell went and he put in 80, there's about 80 pages here. You can actually get a copy of these calculations on the website. But this is the information that we use. For example, right here, the seismic V, that's a ground acceleration. It's the ground acceleration times the weight of the building. That's one of the formulas that is used in these, probably the most important formula that's used in these calculations. But anyway, that's what we will be using on your house, and this will be what's considered a standard plan A retrofit, but not in the methods that are used, because the methods are they're antiquated and they're not particularly effective. But the engineering will definitely be using, because it is the best engineering available. If you have any questions or comments about this video, I would love to hear from you. If you have a question, I'm sure somebody else does, and they would benefit from getting an answer from me. And I don't have anyone that reviews these. I rely on you to review these and let me know, if there's anything that needs to be changed, anything isn't clear, if I made any mistakes, anything at all. So anyway, I do hope to hear from you. Even a little encouragement, just say, hey, you know what, these are great videos. I'd like to keep going. So anyway, I hope to see you at the next video.